The branch groaned under tension. Cottonwood leaves rattled like whispers, and the river carried the heavy scent of sun-baked earth. 3 armed men stood in plain sight, laughing with the arrogance of those who believe the land belongs to them. A young woman dangled by her bound wrists, boots barely kissing the dirt, each breath a battle. A 4th man stood apart, calculating, patient, measuring fear like currency. Then a stranger emerged from the shadows. Worn poncho, heavy-brimmed hat. A voice like cold iron dragged across stone. Nobody breathed. Not even the horses. He said it once more, louder, harder. A sound that carried across rooftops and into memory. Release her. But before we ride headlong into that moment, understand this. Men don't drift into situations like this by chance. And women don't end up dangling beneath cottonwood branches unless somebody decided that land records mattered more than a human. Life Kansas in the spring of 1888 wore a mask of peace. The grass shone green and easy. The wide sky rolled clean above the Flint Hills. A gentle wind moved over the ridgeline like something almost holy. People in the small towns called it a fresh start because people have always needed to believe in fresh starts. But I've watched enough prairie seasons to know better. The land still carried the ghost of that brutal January storm, the one history later named the Children's Blizzard. It had arrived without apology, without warning. Cattle died standing upright, frozen in their final posture. Fence lines disappeared beneath walls of silence and white. Men who had bragged loudly about surviving winters discovered in those terrible hours that they were only men. When the thaw finally crept in, it didn't bring peace behind it. It brought hunger. It brought debt. It brought dangerous thinking. That's when land turns predatory. Railroad surveyors were pressing westward, and their wooden stakes were appearing in pastures and creek bottoms nobody expected. A telegraph operator in one small county seat had begun receiving messages written in polite language that carried the unmistakable weight of a threat. The county records clerk had taken to sealing his ledgers with wax, as though ink could protect itself. In those years, a land deed wasn't merely paper. It was power wrapped in parchment. It was a weapon that required no powder, no trigger. In the frontier town of Cedar Bend, law wore a single face, Sheriff Wade Connecade. Broad across the shoulders, quiet in conversation, and stubborn with a thoroughness that bordered on religion, Wade believed the badge he carried meant exactly what it was supposed to mean. He maintained his deed records inside an iron safe housed in a courthouse that smelled of lamp oil and aged timber. He believed in warrants. He believed in process. He believed in bringing men in breathing. The prairie didn't always share his values. Wade's daughter, Lillian Connecade, was 24 years old that spring, sharp-eyed, strong-willed, and thoroughly exhausted by being treated like something fragile on a high shelf. She had grown up under the constant scrutiny that follows a lawman's family everywhere, spurs on the porch, sideways glances in the saloon, a lifetime of being watched and whispered about. She could ride hard. She could shoot straight. She had learned to hold her chin level when men tried to look down at her. That kind of confidence can carry you a long way. It can also walk you into danger. That afternoon, Lillian dismissed a warning she should have honored. She rode out past the last fence post toward a shallow creek that ran cold and clear, and she gathered wildflowers like the world had kept its promises. The frontier has no patience for ordinary thinking. 6 men took her at the grass line. They moved the way predators do, low and quiet, without ceremony. There was no warning spoken. There was only the sourness of old tobacco on the breeze, the scrape of boots on dry ground, and then burlap darkness dropping over her head. Rope cinched her wrists. The world became muffled fabric, rising dust, and the labor of frightened breathing. These weren't random men fueled by liquor and poor judgment. They were desperate, and desperation develops its own cunning. Their leader was Harlon Crow. He had once carried respect the way certain men do, through hard work and visible grit. But the blizzard had taken half his herd and the entirety of his patience. He didn't sound like the villain you'd read about in a dime novel. He sounded like a man who had decided the world had shorted him and intended to collect what he was owed. Crow wanted what the sheriff kept locked away. He wanted the valley land deeds, the stretch of territory the railroad would pay handsomely for once the tracks cut through. If he could force Sheriff Conancade's hand, he wouldn't merely recover his losses. He'd become the man who owned Cedar Bend. That's the nature of greed. It disguises itself as survival until you can't tell the difference anymore. Crow sent 3 of his hardest men ahead to deliver the opening lesson. People in Cedar Bend came to know them by their qualities rather than their given names. One was called Beryl, thick, mean, built entirely for the purpose of pushing others aside. One was called Rat, too quick to smile, never quite steady in the eyes. The third went by Preacher, a man who quoted scripture while committing acts that no scripture would excuse. They dragged Lillian to a cottonwood near the river, close enough to town that the blacksmith's hammer and the livery stable's particular smell still drifted on the afternoon air. They wanted the town to hear her fear. They wanted people to feel powerless. They wanted that helplessness to spread and do their work for them. Fear always travels faster than news. Lillian didn't give them the performance they wanted. She cursed them with a dry, raw throat. She kicked dirt across Rat's boots. When Beryl pulled the rope cruelly tight, she fixed him with a stare that communicated, with perfect clarity, that she hadn't decided to be afraid of him yet. Men built like Beryl despise women who won't bend. Preacher looped rope over a high branch with the deliberate care of a man who takes pride in his work. He told her it was temporary. I have never once trusted a man who says that while smiling. Then came the creak of rope on bark. The branch complaining under load. The cottonwood leaves trembling. That's when the Nameless rider appeared. He didn't come thundering in. He didn't arrive hollering with drawn iron. He rode the way an experienced ranch hand enters a pen of skittish horses, measured, unhurried, reading everything before committing to anything. His horse was a buckskin, ears forward, steady and attentive as its rider. The man wore a faded green poncho, dark threads fraying at the hem, hiding more than it revealed. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-40s, though the frontier has a way of adding years the way weather adds years, quietly and without permission. His face held the particular tiredness of someone who had slept in difficult places and woken too many mornings with a hand already near iron. His eyes weren't the eyes of a cruel man. People tend to misread that. They were calm, assessing, steady in the way that still water is sometimes deep. My guess is he hadn't planned to stop in Cedar Bend at all. Rat noticed him first, because men like Rat are always watching for movement. He turned, squinted, and laughed the way men laugh when they want to make something disappear by treating it as small. Beryl kept working the rope. Preacher tilted his hat with the mild expression of a man who considers himself above disruption. The rider stopped about 20 feet out. 20 feet is where things become real in the West, near enough to hear breathing, far enough that a mistake might still be corrected if anyone has the sense to make one. No one there had that sense. When he spoke, his voice came out rough and low, like gravel pulled across a dry plank. "Release her," Rat chuckled. Beryl grinned wide. Preacher made a soft, disappointed sound, like a man who has just heard a wrong note sung in church. "You're a long ride from home, old man," Rat said. His voice reached for steadiness and fell short. "I'm exactly where I need to be," the rider answered. Lillian turned toward that voice, hair plastered to her cheek, eyes blazing with equal parts fury and hope. She didn't call out. She didn't reach for gratitude yet. She watched, because living with danger long enough teaches you not to celebrate a miracle before it finishes arriving. Beryl stepped forward, his hand drifting toward his revolver. "Here's something I've come to know over a long life. The man who reaches first usually dies first." He believes too completely in the story he's rehearsed in his head, and real situations don't respect rehearsal. The writer didn't move in a hurry. He moved correctly. His hand came up, the gun spoke once, and Beryl's revolver spun from his grip and landed in the dirt. Beryl stumbled backward, more stunned than wounded, staring at his hand as though it had made a decision without consulting him. Rat's smile collapsed. Preacher's eyes sharpened considerably. Now it grew serious. Rat and Preacher drew fast and careless because fear makes hands stupid. The rider came off his saddle in one smooth, low motion, using the horse's body for cover the way a man uses what he has. Shots split the air. Dust jumped in small, violent bursts. The cottonwood leaves scattered like they were trying to flee. Lillian's arms screamed under the rope's bite. The branch groaned above her. She twisted her body, searching for a way to get her boots beneath her, buying herself seconds one at a time. Seconds have value. Rat leaned wide around the tree trunk, aiming for where he expected the rider to be. He guessed poorly. The rider fired and Rat went to his knees, then went still. No speech, no last words. Just silence arriving, sudden and complete. Preacher cursed and you could hear panic breaking through his voice now. He moved backward, seized Lillian's rope, and hauled her between himself and the rider like she was furniture rather than a person. This is the moment I remember most clearly from when I first encountered this story. Lillian didn't collapse. She didn't surrender to helplessness. She looked at the rider from her terrible position, and she made a choice, her own, independent, deliberate choice. Preacher pressed his revolver hard against her temple. His voice climbed in pitch. I'll do it. You hear me? I will. The rider didn't negotiate through fear. He spoke evenly, like a man reading tomorrow's weather. Let her go, and you might still live to see the moon come up. Preacher's hands shook. Beryl was somewhere nearby, groaning, nursing his wrist, trying to remember how to breathe. The river kept moving, indifferent as always. The Cottonwood complained again beneath the rope's tension. Lillian shifted her weight. She drove her elbow backward into Preacher's ribs with every ounce of force her bound arms could produce. He gasped, startled, and his gun hand dropped for one single heartbeat. One heartbeat in situations like this is a lifetime. The rider rose from behind his horse, aimed, and fired. Preacher's gun left his hand. Preacher hit the dirt. And then there was silence, broken only by Lillian's breathing, ragged and furious and absolutely, stubbornly alive. The rider stepped forward and cut her down quickly, cleanly, not gently because this wasn't a moment for gentleness. This was a moment for effectiveness. He steadied her with a rough, calloused grip. "You're the sheriff's daughter?" he asked. Lillian gave one short nod. She didn't cry. She didn't perform relief. She studied him with the careful attention of someone who has lived close enough to danger to understand that it wears many faces. "What do I call you?" she asked. The rider glanced toward the open prairie, where faint dust was already rising on the horizon. He paused, then offered a small shrug, as though the answer fit him poorly now. "Names don't carry much weight out here," he said. That answer told me everything I needed to know. Men who refuse their own name are either running from one or have buried it alongside someone they couldn't protect. They didn't have time for more. The wind shifted and brought something new, hooves multiple and growing louder. Harlon Crow would have felt his plan unraveling even before a rider told him. Men who've built themselves on domination feel loss in their bones before it fully arrives. "We ride," the drifter said. "Crow doesn't let things go." Lillian tried to straighten her legs. They weren't cooperating. Adrenaline abandons you quickly, and your body is suddenly just a body again, made of ordinary tissue and bone. The rider lifted her onto the buckskin and climbed up in front because one horse doesn't negotiate. It just carries. They rode toward the limestone breaks where the land went rough and broken, where a person could disappear from open sight. Behind them, the dust boiled upward. Crow was already riding. The drifter didn't ride recklessly. He rode intelligently. He kept to low ground, crossed dry washes, avoided every open ridgeline where a silhouette would betray them. The buckskin breathed hard and steady beneath them. Lillian gripped the back of his poncho, knuckles white, refusing to fall. The sun stretched low and turned the grass the color of hammered gold. It was genuinely beautiful, and that's the West's cruelest ongoing joke. The beauty doesn't mean safety. Sometimes it means you're about to pay for the view with blood. After long miles, they found shelter in a dry creek cut through old limestone, a place where water had once carved its path and then moved on. A shallow cave sat recessed in the stone. Not deep enough for luxury, but deep enough to hide a small fire from open country if you were careful about it. The drifter led the buckskin inside, then turned and looked at Lillian with the expression of a man weighing a decision heavier than direction. "We can keep running," he said, "or we can get ahead of them." Lillian swallowed against a throat still raw from rope and dust. "My father will come," she said. "He's the law here." The rider's mouth curved into something tired and thin. "Law is a rope bridge," he said. "Strong men pull it apart easy enough." That landed hard, not because it was cruel, but because Lillian could feel its accuracy and didn't want to. He built a fire deep in the cave, small and shy, using wood dry enough not to betray them with smoke. The flame threw orange light across Lillian's face, showing dust, rope burns, and the stubborn set of a jaw that had refused to soften throughout all of it. "Why do they want you?" he asked. She stared into the fire. "The valley deeds. The railroad corridor my father keeps locked in the courthouse safe." He nodded like he'd already arrived at that conclusion. "Paper and iron," he said quietly. "The new war has always been paper and iron." Lillian looked at him then, really looked. "You're not from Cedar Bend. No, you're not a deputy. You hold no office. No, then what made you stop?" His jaw tightened. His eyes went somewhere distant for a moment, past the fire, past the cave wall, past the present entirely. "Because I've ridden past situations like this before," he said, "and every time I kept going it cost me sleep I never got back. That's a confession. The honest kind, offered without decoration." Outside, the wind changed. Voices drifted in, faint, then less faint. The clink of tack. The drifter rose without a word and pressed himself near the cave mouth, listening with his entire body the way a man listens when rattlesnakes are somewhere in tall grass. "They're near," he whispered. Lillian's fingers found a jagged stone near her boot, because when fear arrives, you reach for whatever is within reach. 5 riders moved along the dry creek bed below, slow and methodical, reading tracks, searching for the warmth of a recent fire. One carried a lantern. The yellow swing of that light felt like something hunting. The drifter pressed 2 fingers of dirt into the flame. Darkness swallowed the cave completely. Lillian's heartbeat felt so loud she was certain the riders below could hear it. She gripped the stone. She was not going quietly. She was her father's daughter in every meaningful way. The lantern drew closer. Crow's men were not merely angry. They were humiliated, and humiliated men take risks that calculated men don't. The drifter did the cold arithmetic. He'd been doing this particular math for too many years. 5 riders, an exhausted horse, open ground, and a woman who'd already been through more than most people survive in a lifetime. A frontal engagement solved nothing, so he didn't engage directly. He slipped from the cave sideways, moving where stone met stone, avoiding gravel, using the wind to carry his scent away. The lantern paused as a rider leaned to read the ground. The drifter came up behind that rider like a piece of the darkness itself. The rider never heard him arrive. The drifter relieved him of his rifle and ammunition belt and melted back into shadow before anyone turned around. Then a voice rang out, loud, confident, dressing itself in authority it hadn't earned. "Drifter. I know you're in there. Give us the girl and ride out clean. You've got my word on a 10-minute head start." Lillian felt her stomach turn over. Even she understood instinctively what that promise was actually worth. The drifter listened to the rhythm of the men below, pistol hammers drawn back, boots scraping stone, a whispered consultation. He raised the stolen rifle. He didn't aim at a man. He aimed at the lantern. The shot cracked. Glass exploded. Darkness fell like a wall dropped from the sky. The riders below panicked immediately, firing blindly into black, muzzle flashes lighting their own fear in brief orange bursts. The drifter stayed motionless, counting. He let them empty their courage into the darkness. When the hammer started clicking on spent chambers, he moved. He fired measured and clean, addressing threats without announcement. 2 men went down. The rest came apart, horses bolting, riders shouting, the creek bed dissolving into chaos. Crow's men fell back, not because they'd suddenly discovered principle, but because fear had beaten pride. The drifter returned to the cave entrance, breathing measured, eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who has done terrible necessary things too many times. Lillian stood exactly where he'd left her, stone still raised, not yet certain it was over. "Gone?" she asked. "For now. But dawn brings more men and better light. Then we reach my father before dawn." He nodded once. "Waiting is a privilege the dead can afford. No one else." They left the cave in full darkness, the buckskin working across cold ground with the patient strength of a horse that understood its job. Twice they stopped long enough to let the animal breathe properly, because the horse was doing the most honest work of anyone present. Near morning, they found a town along an old trail route, solid stone buildings, a water trough, telegraph wire humming faintly in the pre-dawn wind. A weathered sign marked the main street. The drifter led the buckskin into a livery stable and paid the stall fee with coins that looked like they'd crossed several territories to get there. The stable hand accepted payment and asked nothing. Experienced frontiermen recognize when questions aren't invited. They found lodging at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Hattie Rowe. She took one look at the rope marks on Lillian's wrists, one look at the drifter's hollowed-out eyes, and she simply nodded. She produced stew that was thick and aggressively salted, and a room with shutters that latched tight. That stew tasted like someone had decided quietly to be decent. The drifter didn't sleep. He pulled a chair to the window and watched the street pass from dark into gray into pale gold. I've known men who sit through nights like that. It isn't heroism. It's a man who's decided he doesn't deserve rest, administering his own quiet punishment. Lillian sat on the bed, holding her wrists, staring at the floorboards. "He'll come," she said again softly, as though saying it created the reality. "My father will come." "Maybe," the drifter said without moving from the window. "Maybe not in time." There it was, in the oldest tension the frontier ever produced. The lawful path said wait. Let the proper machinery of justice move at its own pace. The right path said prepare, because the wolves don't wait for court schedules. At sunrise, the drifter saw the dust. Not a thin line, a rolling cloud. 10 riders, perhaps 12, moving down the main street with the unhurried arrogance of men who don't expect resistance. Harlon Crow rode at the front on a black stallion, his face drawn tight with the particular fury of a man who considers himself owed obedience. Crow stopped beside an elderly man carrying a flour sack. He pressed a pistol to the man's head in plain sight and shouted his demand across the street. "Where is she?" The town stopped breathing. Shopkeepers retreated into doorways. A blacksmith's hammer paused mid-swing. Horses at the hitching rail shifted uneasily, reading the change in atmosphere the way horses always do before humans fully register it. The drifter stepped back from the window. "It's time to move." Lillian's face went pale. "We're cornered." "A man is only cornered when he stops," the drifter replied. He opened a storage crate in the corner. Inside lay a long rifle and a careful count of rounds he'd quietly arranged during his night watch. He checked the action with hands that didn't shake. Then he looked at Lillian. "Your father teach you to use a pistol?" "Thoroughly," she said. "Good. Don't think too long before you pull. Hesitation is where people get buried." They went down the back staircase, through a narrow alley smelling of coal smoke and old refuse, and climbed to the roof of the general store. From that elevation, Cedar Bend looked achingly small. Crow's riders spread across the street below, like something the prairie had finally coughed up. Crow bellowed his demands, the deeds, the girl, surrender, like a man who believed the open sky was his personal courtroom. The drifter set the long rifle to his shoulder and fired, not at Crow, not yet. He fired into the hitching post beside the riders. Wood erupted. Horses lurched free and scattered. The composed procession Crow had arranged dissolved instantly into noise and collision, because men can tolerate danger, but they cannot tolerate losing control of a situation they believed they owned. Lillian took position behind a chimney stack, pistol level, breathing through her mouth. She fired once and missed. She fired again. A rider slumped from his saddle without ceremony. She didn't celebrate. She reloaded. She had learned in a very compressed period what real stakes feel like. The drifter moved across the rooftops, changing position constantly, keeping Crow's men guessing, making himself a storm rather than a target. Some of Crow's riders ducked behind water troughs. Others tried to flank through a side alley. The drifter caught one of those and dropped him clean. Then Crow made his decision. Burn it down. Because when authority slips from a man's hands, he reaches for fire. It's the oldest response in the record. Smoke began at the edges. Panic followed smoke. Mothers gathered children and ran. Men pressed themselves against wagon wheels. The church bell stayed silent. Nobody wanted to announce what was happening. Crow was watching more carefully now. He was smarter than his hired men, and he recognized the center of the problem. He sent 4 men through the front of the general store to trap the drifter above it. The drifter ran out of roof. He dropped through the access hatch into the loft, landing hard in old straw. Boots hammered the stairs. The space was too tight for long rifles, so he set his aside and used what the moment offered. What happened in that loft was not dramatic in the way stories prefer. It was close and harsh and brief, and when it ended, he was climbing out a window and dropping to the street because staying put meant being cornered, and cornered meant finished. Then a sound cut through everything, a sharp cry from the direction of the boarding house. Crow had found Lillian. He had her in the open street, one arm across her shoulders, her body between himself and whatever direction the drifter might appear from. His pistol was raised. Lillian's face was white with dust and hard with anger. The drifter walked out into the middle of the street. He walked steadily, not fast. The way a man walks when he's done running from something. Wind moved dust around his boots. The street was utterly silent, the held-breath silence of a community that doesn't know if it will survive the next 60 seconds. Crow smiled. He believed he had finally arrived at the ending he deserved.
"Drop the iron, Drifter!"
"Set it down!" The drifter's arms hung loose at his sides. "I've seen enough of this town to know it doesn't belong to you, Crow," he said. Then his voice rose, sharp and carrying, cutting across the whole street. "Release her." Crow laughed, but the laugh was thin at the edges. "You're borrowing time you don't have." "Maybe so," the drifter said. "But you're not leaving this street with her. Not today. Not any day." Crow's finger moved against the trigger. Lillian's breath hitched. And then Lillian Connecade, daughter of the law, survivor of rope and blizzard cold terror and a very long night, did what she had decided to do. She drove her heel backward into Crow's shin with everything she had. He jolted. His grip loosened for one single heartbeat. Lillian twisted at the shoulders, rotating his gun arm offline, breaking his angle. That heartbeat was the door, and the drifter walked through it without hesitation. His gun came up. One shot, clean and precise. Crow's weapon hit the dirt. Crow staggered, suddenly ordinary, suddenly human, suddenly without his borrowed power. His men saw it. Their collective resolve cracked like old timber. They hadn't signed up out of loyalty. They'd signed up for wages and the safety of numbers. When the man supplying both came apart, what remained was individual men rediscovering their individual fear. Some fired aimlessly and stopped. Some backed toward their horses. Some simply turned and rode, letting the prairie take them. The drifter's knees bent slightly. Not much, but enough. The body eventually collects what it's owed. Lillian reached him and gripped his arm with both hands. Small hands, but with a grip that didn't discuss compromise. She looked at him. Her face was dusty and streaked and entirely certain. "We made it through," she said. He nodded once, slow. "We did." 2 hours after the street went quiet, Sheriff Wade Connecade rode into town with his deputies, dust on their hat brims, controlled anger on their faces. He took one look at his daughter, alive and standing. He took one look at the street. He understood how close it had been. Wade walked to the drifter, and the two men regarded each other the way two different kinds of justice sometimes do, measuring, recognizing, neither entirely comfortable with what the other represents. "You saved my daughter," Wade said. His voice carried weight he was working hard to contain. "I did what needed doing," the drifter said. Wade looked toward the courthouse, toward the iron safe, toward the legal future Crow had spent months attempting to steal and lost in a single violent morning. "You saved more than her," the sheriff said. "You saved this county's future." Then Wade did what lawmen do when they want to make honest use of a capable man. He produced a badge and held it out. "Cottonwood Crossing needs someone who doesn't flinch when things get difficult," he said. "Someone like you." The drifter looked at that badge for a long moment. I could feel the weight of the choice across the years, the settled life, the steady purpose, the chance to stop being a man without a fixed address. He shook his head. "A badge is a bright target with a pin attached," he said. "I've collected enough targets for one lifetime." Lillian stepped close. "You're riding out." It wasn't quite a question. She already knew. He looked west, toward the purple-edged horizon, toward whatever trouble the wind was already arranging out there. "The trail doesn't end here for me," he said simply. He mounted the buckskin slowly, because pain had finally decided to make itself known, and he no longer had reasons to pretend otherwise. "Stay safe, Lillian Connecade," he said. "Don't let the grass grow tall around your feet. Keep your father's courage where it belongs, right at the center of you." Then he rode out. He didn't look back. Men like that rarely do. Looking backward is how old ghosts find a handhold. Cedar Bend watched him shrink to a dot, then a suggestion, then nothing at all. The prairie received him the way it receives everything eventually, quietly, without ceremony, without explanation. Lillian lived a full and long life. She married a steady man, Not loud, not decorated with reputation, and she raised children who ran through tall grass laughing, children who had no reason to know how cruel the world sometimes decides to be. But every spring, when the Kansas green deepened and the Flint Hills turned that particular shade that has no equivalent elsewhere, she remembered. Rope and wind, a creaking branch, a voice that arrived from the shade like something that had decided, against its own best interest, to be present. Release her. Friends of the long trail, this story carries something permanent inside it. Courage has never been the absence of fear. It has always been the decision to stand when sitting would be easier. It's about placing yourself between the vulnerable and the violent. It's about the tempered iron that lives inside an ordinary human soul. Iron that neither rusts nor breaks, no matter how long the winter runs. If this ride stirred something in you today, do one thing before you go. Subscribe to our camp and ride with us into the next story. We have more dust to raise, more legends buried in the dirt waiting to be found. Our next journey takes us to the California goldfields, where a solitary miner uncovers something far more dangerous and far more valuable than anything the mountains were supposed to contain. Until then, keep your powder dry, keep your eyes on the horizon, and may your trail always find its way home.